Hi everyone, today we're going to be doing the Rusty Patch Bumblebee training for Iowa Bumblebee Atlas participants. My name is Katie Lamke. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society based in Lincoln, Nebraska. And Genevieve Pugesic, who you may have heard from if you've adopted an Iowa grid cell or you've conducted a training, she's our head coordinator there. So this training is for people that need the additional guidelines. So you've adopted a grid cell that has a high potential zone or a low potential zone. So we'll go over what that means and how we can safely work within the federal guidelines because this is an endangered species. So today we're just going to cover an introduction to the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, cover the different types of grid cells that you can adopt, where you can survey within that grid cell, what to do if you find a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and then lastly, how to identify the species. So the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, if you're not familiar with it, was the first bee actually to gain federal protection on the U.S. Endangered Species Act back in 2017. And it gained that level of protection because it has such severe documented declines. There's been a nearly 50% decline in its range and over a 90% decline in its relative abundance. So, how many of these individuals in the species actually exist on the landscape. So because of that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has given federal protection to this species. And essentially that just means that we need to be more cautious when we're conducting these surveys so that we're not causing more harm to this bee. So each year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts out this map of locations where the species has been located or they think that it might be located. So we call these high and low potential zones. So high potential zones are the red points that you see on this map, and those are areas where the Rusty Patch Bumblebee is currently occupying. The low potential zones, or those areas in yellow, are areas where the bee is likely to be occupying them. So in order to conduct surveys inside of these high or low potential zones, you need to have a federal scientific collecting permit. And most volunteers and participants are not going to have that. So essentially this training is going to walk you through how to avoid entering these areas and what to do if you come across a Rusty Patch Bumblebee outside of these areas, because it is very likely to happen. And this map is updated annually. So, if you conduct a survey somewhere this year that is maybe outside of one of these higher low potential zones, somebody finds a Rusty Patch Bumblebee in your area, you might have to find somewhere else to survey the following year. So keep checking this map. It's updated in the spring just to make sure that you're staying within the federal guidelines. We don't want anybody going into these zones that don't have a permit. So we've set this up hopefully in a clear fashion. There are 3 different tiers of grid cells. So the tier 1 grid cells are areas that don't have any sort of Rusty Patch Bumblebee, whether it's a high potential or a low potential zone. Anybody can adopt those. There's no additional training needed, though it is encouraged that you learn how to identify the Rusty Patch Bumblebee just in case. Then tier 2 are grid cells that have less than 50% of an area taken up by a higher low potential zone. And then tier 3 are grid cells that are occupied by more than 50% of those higher low potential zones. So I'm going to walk through guidelines for tier 2 cells and tier 3 cells today and what you need to do if you've adopted one of these and how to stay safe when working in them. So starting with the tier 2 grid cells, these will be indicated on the grid map when you go to adopt a grid cell, or if you've already adopted a grid cell, you know it. There are 2 asterisks in front of the ID number. So IA23, Iowa 23 there. That is a grid cell that's going to have asterisks by it when you go to adopt it, just to alert you that there's going to be additional training that you need to conduct. So again, anybody can adopt these grid cells, but you'll just have to work to make sure that you're staying outside of the high and low potential zones, which are indicated by the yellow spots on the map here. And once you adopt that, you'll have to review this training and then take a short quiz, essentially demonstrating that you understand the guidelines, you know how to identify the bee, and you know what steps you need to take if you find a rusty patch bumblebee. So it's nothing too difficult. We're just taking the extra steps to make sure that we are working within those federal guidelines. So if you've adopted one of these tier 2 grid cells, you want to survey outside of these high and low potential zones, so outside of the yellow areas on the map, unless you are with somebody that holds a federal permit or you're conducting a photo-only survey. So photo-only surveys we don't encourage because the level of data quality that's collected on a photo-only survey is significantly lower than the standard survey where you net bees, chill them, and photograph them. So try to avoid doing that. Conduct your surveys outside of these high and low potential zones, and I'll show you a couple tools that you can use to make sure that within your grid cell you're surveying in a correct area. In these grid cells, you also only want to keep bees on ice for under 2 hours, just in case you have a rusty patch bumblebee inside of your survey area. We don't want them to be on ice for too long because they'll lose valuable foraging time, and we don't want to cause any harm to them if they're on ice for too long. Let's look at the next slide here. So while you're in these tier 2 cells, definitely keep your eyes out for rusty patch bumblebees. So just because you're outside of a high or low potential zone doesn't mean that the rusty patch bumblebee won't exist there. It's likely through this Iowa Bumblebee Atlas that we're going to be finding new locations of the species, which is a good thing, right? We want to know where it exists and what it's foraging on, what habitats it's in. So definitely keep your eyes out while you're surveying. And if you think you have found a rusty patch bumblebee outside of these high or low potential zones, you're going to want to stop your survey, try and take a photo of the bee as best you can. So sometimes, if you have a clear plastic container, you can just photograph the bee through that, try and get a few different angles, and you'll want to send those photos to Jenny Pujesic or the Iowa team. The emails are listed right there. They will be on the website. It would be a good idea to write these down, bring them into the field with you, or keep them in your phone somewhere, just in case you do find one of these bees. We need to report these new locations to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pretty quickly. I think it's within 48 hours. So if you think you've found one of these bees, take a photo, email the state coordinator, and we will get back to you. So then tier 3 grid cells, these are the grid cells that have more than 50% of the area taken up by a high or low potential zone. So we're sort of being extra cautious here. It's likely that the rusty patch bumblebee occurs in this grid cell. So rather than having people just stay outside of the high and low potential zones, you must have a federal permit to adopt these grid cells. And there's only 4 of them you can see in the corner there: Iowa 36, 28, 10, and 19. So these are just areas where we're being extra cautious. If you adopt one of these grid cells, you still have to review this training, take that quiz that again demonstrates that you understand the federal guidelines, which you do if you have a permit. You know how to identify the bee, and you know what steps you need to take if you find one. You're also going to want to share the permit number with Jenny Pujesic or the Iowa State Coordinator. And again, her email is listed right there, just so that we can make sure that you have a permit and everything is good to go. So again, within these grid cells, similar to those tier 2 grid cells, you don't want to keep bees on ice for more than 2 hours. If possible, if you have to take a photograph and it's not working through your clear container, you can put them on ice for a small amount of time to chill them a little bit, take a good photograph, but definitely try and release them within 15 minutes so that they can get back to their foraging. We're not causing extra harm to whatever work they're trying to get done. People that are permitted may survey anywhere within the grid cell, even if it's inside an HPZ or an LPZ. And again, if you think you've found a rusty patch bumblebee, you're going to want to stop the survey, take a photograph, send it to Jenny and the Iowa team. Emails are listed right there just so that we can keep track of these sightings and report them to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So for all of the grid cells, well, I guess the tier 2 and tier 3 grid cells, we have a couple of tools that you can utilize to make sure that you're surveying in the correct area. So if you've adopted one of the tier 2 grid cells, but you don't have a permit and you need to stay outside of these yellow areas on the map, there are 3 places that you can go to sort of make sure that you're staying within those guidelines. The first one is just looking at the Bumblebee Atlas grid adoption map. The next one is using the Google map of grid cells that we've overlaid. And then the third one is looking at the Rusty Patch Bumblebee map that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service updates. So I'm going to sort of show you how those work here. Let me get out a full screen. So the first one is just on the Bumblebee Atlas webpage. If you go up to Get Involved here, down to Adopt a Grid Cell, it will bring you to this page. And you want to scroll down. If you've already adopted your grid cell, if you're familiar with this map, then we can zoom in using the mouse, or you can use these buttons here. We want to zoom into Iowa. And it looks a little bit chaotic because all the grid cells of participating Bumblebee Atlas projects are on here, right? So we can see Pacific Northwest, California, Montana, Mountain States, Great Plains. If you click this top button here, it will bring you to the legend. And then we can scroll down to Midwest Great Plains. Oops, there we go. And then to Iowa. So here we have the legend showing the blue grid cells in Iowa are high priorities for this summer, meaning we want people to survey in these blue grid cells. But what we want to pay attention to are these yellow striped grid cells. So you have to have a permit to adopt these. Again, you can see these 4 grid cells here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then all of the grid cells that have 2 asterisks in front of them. So this Iowa 26, Iowa 27, Iowa 25, anything that has an asterisk means you need to take this training, take a quiz, make sure you know how to identify rusty patch bumblebee because there's a chance it could occur in your grid cell. So using this map, you can either zoom in and out to find somewhere you want to survey or a grid cell that you want to adopt. You can also use the search bar. So let's say Jester Park Nature Center, and as you type, places should populate for you and give you different options. So Jester Park Nature Center, I can click close and it's going to keep this point here on the map for me. And as I zoom out, I'm going to see that Jester Park is blue. So that means it is in a priority grid cell. But I also see that it has the asterisks. So that means this high potential zone, low potential zone here, while it's not in that area, I need to take extra training if I adopt this grid cell. That being said, because Jester Park is outside of the high potential zone, I would be okay to survey there. If I wanted to survey in Boone and I didn't hold a permit, I would not be able to do that unless I was going with somebody that had a federal permit or I was going to do a photo only survey. But again, we don't encourage the photo only surveys, which is there's no netting, there's no chilling of bees, you're just taking pictures of bees on a flower. The data quality from those is a lot less than our standard surveys. So we don't encourage those, but sometimes, that's the only survey that people can do if it's on their property, say. So the other tool that you can use is the Iowa grid map that we've put on Google Maps. So again, we have all the high potential and low potential zones. We have the grids. So using this, let's say you've adopted your grid cell and you're in Iowa 34, right? You can kind of scroll in and see, okay, there's no high or low potential zones here. So you would be good to survey anywhere. If you adopted Iowa 43, you would have to make sure that your survey area is outside of this. So let's say we wanted to survey it Woodland Mound State Preserve. We would be okay to do that because it's not within this yellow zone. However, if we wanted to do a survey, well, we can't do one there. We're not permitted to survey on Fish and Wildlife Service land. Let's check out a little park in here. Green areas on a map are usually parks, if you didn't know that, or green spaces. They're usually good places to survey. Prairie City Recreational Complex, we would not be able to survey there, again, because we're inside that yellow zone. The last tool you can use is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife map that they update each year. So here are all the places where the rusty patch bumblebee occurs or is currently occupying, or areas where they think the bee is likely to be occupying. So scrolling into Iowa, right, we can kind of see those high potential zones are in red, low potential zones are in yellow. They're not permitted federally. You cannot go into these zones to conduct an actual survey. So you can type in on here, let's say I want to look at Davenport. A lot of Davenport is covered in a high potential zone and a low potential zone. So if there's a more specific park or an address that you want to see, you know, where does this location sit? Does it fall within one of these zones? Do I need to be cautious? You can use this map. You can check out the search bar. So 3 tools to kind of help you, and the state coordinator, so myself or Genevieve Pugesic, or, you know, our folks at Iowa DNR that are helping, Iowa State University, we can all assist you in this if you need help finding a place and making sure that you're staying outside of those high and low potential zones. Let's get back to the slideshow. Okay. So if you happen to find a rusty patch bumblebee outside of one of those higher low potential zones, really exciting, right? That's a new location. That means we're learning more about the species, what it's foraging on, what habitats it's in, all the information that we need to do a better job supporting it. But there are a few things that we want to do. So you're going to want to stop your survey immediately, right? We don't want to continue the survey there if there are rusty patch bumblebees in the area. Do your best to take a photograph of the species. You can send in a few pictures if one isn't cutting it. It's hard to photograph bees through plastic sometimes because your camera will try and focus on the plastic rather than the bee. So it can be a little bit difficult, but do your best. Sometimes Tupperware works a little bit better than the 50 milliliter tube, so it would be good to have some of those on hand. You're going to want to email those photographs to Jenny or somebody on the Iowa team again, and those contacts can be reached there by these email addresses, and you'll want to send the date, location, and photographs, and we will get back to you on that. If it is a verified sighting, the next time you conduct a survey, you're going to want to avoid that area. So pick a new location to survey that's at least 1.5 kilometers away from your original survey spot, just to avoid coming into contact with more rusty patch bumblebees. And you can go back to that same location if you're with somebody that's permitted, or you're going to conduct a photo-only survey. But again, we don't encourage the photo-only surveys. You can see some people here are doing a photo-only survey. The bees can sometimes get skittish, they'll fly away. Maybe you don't get the right photographs to determine the bee down to the species level. Sometimes you need a really up close picture of the bee's face to get an identification at the species level. So again, photo only surveys are not always the best, but if you have to do them, like say if it's the rusty patch bumblebee was sighted in your yard and that's where you're planning to survey is on your acreage, we understand that that happens sometimes. So if you want to become somebody that can go into these high and low potential zones in 2025, you can apply to become a sub-permittee on the Xerces Society's federal collecting permit. And there's a few things that you need to do for this, right? So Xerces is not in charge of who gets on our permit. The Fish and Wildlife Service ultimately decides whether or not somebody is qualified enough to be listed on our permit. So to apply for this, you need at least 2 letters of recommendation. Xerces can provide one of those, and you need experience surveying for and identifying the rusty patch bumblebee. So if you want to apply to be a subcommittee, a few things that you should work on this year are just attending in-person training events, getting to know the Xerces Society staff so that they can speak for you if you want us to write one of your letters, submitting your bumblebee observations to Bumblebee Watch with the appropriate identification. So we can see when observations are submitted to Bumblebee Watch, the backside of the data shows us what you submitted the bumblebee as and what the verifier said the bee actually was. So the more that you are able to correctly identify species, the better you'll be for this. You'll also want to conduct more than the minimum number of surveys. So the more experience you have going out, netting bees, chilling bees, photographing bees, the better setup you'll be for this permit application. And this needs to be the standard Atlas surveys. So going out and actually netting, photo only surveys do not count for this. And again, Xerces doesn't decide who gets listed on the permit. It is up to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But if you are somebody that wants to be able to access these high and low potential zones, keep that in mind as you're going through the season and making sure that you're doing all the things that you can to set yourself up for success. Okay, so this last part, we're going to add a video here that's been pre-recorded by our partners at the University of Minnesota. They're going to describe how to identify the rusty patch bumblebee and talk about some of the lookalike species that you might encounter in the field. If you have additional questions on identifying the rusty patch bumblebee, University of Minnesota has some great resources on their website. You can also find an identification guide on the Bumblebee Atlas website that's specific to identifying the rusty patch bumblebee. I think that's it. The quiz for taking the actual quiz, will be emailed to you. So when you adopt one of these grid cells where the extra training is required and the quiz is required, that will be linked in your confirmation email. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Iowa Bumblebee team. So myself or Jenny P. Jessic, our coordinators at DNR, Iowa State University. All of our contacts are listed on Iowa Bumblebee Atlas. So if you go to bumblebeeatlas.org, you'll find everything that you need there. All right, thanks.
So I do see just a question from Heidi. I'll just go ahead and do this before we switch over to Elise for some ID stuff. So Heidi says, I have grid 38 and I don't see the red area in mine. I was looking this morning and I couldn't find a map with the red area in my grid. Is this map up to date? So I did just update, actually just yesterday, I updated our map that we have on the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas website because the Fish and Wildlife Service did update again just at the end of May, May 30th. So really recently. And so there may be some updates there. If you are looking at the oh, sorry. I just have to exclude my cat from this room. The map that we have currently on the Minnesota BS Atlas website is the one that's up to date. So you may have had a red zone. It may have gotten removed. There were some spots where that happened. And I'm going to hand things over to Elise to go over some of these ID.
Awesome. Thank you. So when we are taking a look for our rusty patch bumblebees, there's a few key characters that we want to be keeping a specific eye out for. So we'll start with the thorax. On the back of the thorax, right between the wing bases, the rusty patch has sort of an umbrella shape or a thumbtack shape. It's kind of what you're seeing there, that top red arrow is pointing to. And then on their abdomen, we're also looking out for that rusty patch. So the first abdominal segment on the rusty patch T1 is all yellow. And then on T2, there's that little brown rusty swoop kind of in the middle with yellow underneath it. So I kind of like to think of it like the rusty patch is sort of sandwiched in there in the yellow that we're seeing on T1 and T2. And the males are also similar. They have a similar color pattern to the females. So when we're trying to figure out if it's rusty patch or not, we don't have to worry about a difference in color between the males and the females. Next slide, please.
Nope.
All right, so here's just a couple images of rusty patch bumblebee from a few different angles. So on the left, this image pretty clearly shows that thumbtack or umbrella shape between the wing bases on the thorax. We've got that black band that stretches across with a little bit of black moving down towards the abdomen, and then a really, really clear rusty patch. It's important to note in this image that T1 is fairly small. There's just a little, it's a lot thinner than the band on T2. So it looks like there's just a little bit of yellow before we're seeing that rusty patch that's sandwiched in there in the yellow on T1 and T2. In our image of the rusty patch on the right, it's a little bit harder because it's at a bit of a different angle, but we still can see the rusty patch on T2 there, but it's a lot lighter in color. They're not always so distinct. So that's also really important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Here's another really awesome, very clear, distinct photo of a rusty patch bumblebee. She's also doing something that's kind of characteristic of rusty patch, where she's nectar robbing in this flower. So she's poking holes towards the base of the flower rather than going in at the top where the pollen is. But we can again really clearly see that umbrella or thumbtack shape on her thorax, really clear black band between the wing bases. The base of the umbrella or the thumbtack is a little bit less distinct, but we still see that there with those black hairs. Then T1, the yellow on T1 is a little bit more distinct in this photo, and that rusty patch, the brown rusty band, is really, really distinct. It really stands out here, so we can really see where that sits between those two little bits of yellow. Next slide. So there are a lot of species that are commonly mistaken for rusty patch bumblebees, one of which being the brown-belted bumblebee, or Bombus griseocolus, which is in the big three bumblebees. This is one of the most common bumblebees we see here, especially in the Twin Cities. I know about 80% of all the bumblebees that we're seeing are the big three. So it's important to know how to tell the difference between the brown-belted and the rusty patch. So we're primarily looking at the abdomen here for the key characters of the brown-belted bumblebee. The first abdominal segment, so T1 on the brown-belted, is all yellow, just like rusty patch, but T2 is where we see differences. So here for the brown-belted bumblebee, there's just that brown or orangish swoop or crescent shape on T2, or the second abdominal segment, but there's not yellow surrounding it. We can still see black on either side of that brown crescent. So there's black on the edges of that second abdominal segment. If we also look at the thorax, there's just a black sort of spot of hairs between the wing bases. We're not seeing that clearer, distinct umbrella shape. And the males are also similar in color pattern. They have the same color pattern on their abdomens, with the first abdominal segment being yellow, followed by that brown or orangish crescent shape with black on either side, but they have really large eyes. Next slide, please. So here's a good photo of the brown-belted bumblebee. We know this is a female because she's got those really big globs of that orange pollen on her hind legs. But if we're taking a look at her abdomen here, we can see that first abdominal segment is all yellow. It's kind of a deep, rich shade of yellow, so paying attention to kind of the colors of yellow on these bumblebees is also important. But then when we look at T2, we're seeing black on the sides before we see that brown crescent or swoop there in the middle. And remember, with rusty patch, the brown crescent is kind of sandwiched in between yellow that we see on both T1 and T2. So noting the black on the sides here is really important to distinguish brown-belted bumblebee. Next slide. So this next bee that's often mistaken for rusty patch is Bombus ternarius, or the tricolored bumblebee. And this is one of the most common bumblebees in the northern half of the state. So we often hear people say, oh, there's rusty patch bumblebee everywhere in northern Minnesota, but it's actually just the tricolored bumblebee because they have fairly similar characteristics. So they also have that on their thorax, a similar shaped umbrella or thumbtack kind of band, but it's a little bit thicker than what you see on rusty patch. When we see an actual photo of this bee, that'll be a little bit easier to tell the difference in shape. And then rather than having a crescent or swoop of brown rusty hairs on T2, the second and third, so T2 and T3, the abdominal segments on the tricolored bumblebee are a bright orange or a bright red in color. So they stand out a lot. So we have yellow, and then we've got two segments of that red or orangish, and then yellow. And the males are also similar. Next slide. So this really shows the difference in the size of that black umbrella-shaped band on the thorax between the wing bases. So it's a lot wider and a lot thicker than what we see on rusty patch. And in this bee in particular, those two abdominal segments, T2 and T3, are very distinct. They're very orange, really standing out. So there's a lot more color on this bee than we see on rusty patch. And then here's another example of a tricolored bumblebee where T2 and T3 are a little bit less distinct. So we still see that umbrella-shaped band on the thorax, but we still know that it's the tricolored and not rusty patch because the band is so thick. And then when we're looking at the abdomen, T2 and T3 are still orange. It's just faded a little bit and not as distinctly bright orange. Another bee that is also sometimes mistaken for rusty patch is Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee. And this is often with the queens. So our rusty patch queens actually don't have the rusty patch in most cases, or the thumbtack shape. They just have their first two abdominal segments are yellow, which is the distinguishing characteristic of Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee. So there's just that one small patch of black hairs between the wing bases, and then T1 and T2, the first two abdominal segments are yellow, and the males are similar with this one. And another thing that's important to note with Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee, is kind of the appearance of the hairs. So these are a really shaggy bumblebee. You can kind of tell, especially in that photo on the left, the way that their hairs are sort of shaggy. And that's not something that is necessarily characteristic of the rusty patch. But here we just see those first two abdominal segments are clearly very yellow. We're not seeing any evidence of any sort of rusty patch or anything like that.
And one thing I'll just add in with vegans is IDing from photos. It can be tricky where you can kind of see it a little bit on this one on the right, just on the side here, where those hairs look kind of darker as opposed to the rest of the yellow, but that's just kind of, you're just kind of seeing through to the cuticle. And so sometimes even it'll be just in that exact spot where a rusty patch would be in that middle of that second abdominal segment, it'll look darker. And yeah, so it can be tricky. Bombus vagans can also be pretty common, especially up north. Just making sure with the photos that we can kind of clearly see what's try to be careful with lightings for some of these, so we can, when we're going through an IDing, we can make sure that what we're seeing is the color of the hair and not just a shadow.
All right, so another bee that also is sometimes mistaken for rusty patch is the red-belted bumblebee, or Bombus rufosinctus. And Bombus rufosinctus has a lot of different variations in their color pattern, but they have a pretty distinct band of black hairs between the wing bases. Because of its shape, we kind of refer to it as the Eye of Sauron, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings. But that's something that distinguishes the red-belted bumblebee from the rusty patch. And on the abdomen, the Bombus rufosinctus, or the red-belted, always has the first abdominal segment yellow, and then the second one usually or always has a sort of yellow crescent shape. The hairs are sort of in a crescent shape, which is then followed by either black or red. So the reddish ones are sometimes the ones that are more commonly mistaken for rusty patch bumblebee. People see the red or orangish color, and sometimes we'll generally associate that with rusty patch, but you want to make sure you're taking a look at what's happening on the first two abdominal segments. So in this case, with that red belted on the right, on the top there, we're seeing the crescent of yellow hairs followed by red, whereas on rusty patch, that crescent shape would be the brown rusty color, followed by just a little bit of yellow on the rest of T2. So here's just a couple photos of the red-belted bumblebee. So we can see in both of these images, it's a little bit easier to see the thorax in the photo on the right. There's that round band between the wing bases that sort of looks like an eye shape. And then we are seeing yellow on the first abdominal segment with that little crescent of yellow, then on the second, followed by T2 and T3 and T4 are both that reddish color rather than black as they would be on the rusty patch.
And just another note on the red belted, a lot of times those reddish or orangish hairs are intermixed with black hairs. So it's when you see the rusty patch on the rusty patch, it's consistent. Well, whereas these, besides being in a different spot, they'll be kind of mixed in with different colors of hairs, kind of all mixed in together.
Another bee that is also can be mistaken for rusty patch is Bombus citrinus, or the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, but specifically the males. So the males and the females for this bee have different color patterns, but the males also have a sort of T shape or umbrella or thumbtack shape on the abdomen, or on their thorax, excuse me, but their abdomen is what's different. So their abdominal segments T1, T2, and T3. So the first three are all yellow, which is quite a bit different from the rusty patch. And these bees you are typically just seeing in the late summer.
And just to note that sometimes these males can be very common. So, and you really don't see them until late summer. So a lot of times people aren't used to looking out for them or forget about them by the time it gets to be August and these are showing up. So this is one to just take note of and remember that you're fairly likely to see them in the late summer, especially in the southern part of Minnesota. They also, so this is one of these cuckoo bumblebees, they also have really big heads. So their heads are just a lot thicker than other bumblebees. If you think you might have one, just take a look at what's going on their head.